Right, on behalf of the Francisco de Vitoria University, it is an honor to introduce Professor Anders Sandberg, who's going to be the speaker at this session. He's going to be making a presentation on transhumanism and posthumanism. His talk will be recorded so that we can avoid technical problems. He will be with us, but we will now show his video. He is a principal researcher of Oxford University. His research at the university is based on high-impact risks, the ethical issues around human improvement, the estimation of the capacities of future technologies in the very long term. The topics that are of special concern for him are global catastrophic risks, existential risks, cognitive improvement, neuroethics, the set for extraterrestrial intelligence, transhumanism, and public policies. He's a senior member of the Oxford Martin School and an associate researcher of the Yojiro Center of Practical Ethics at Oxford, the Neuroethics Center at Oxford, the Bioethics Center in Belgrade, and he is an activist of the SETI network of the US, and he is a member of different organizations, and he is a very well-known speaker in international media. He's got a degree in IT and medical engineering. He got his PhD at University of Stockholm in Switzerland, in the area of neuronal networks. So this is going to be the opening lecture, and trying to explain that truth is not an ideology. So we hope that this conference will bring us closer to the realities of human beings. We welcome Professor Sandberg. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me here. And I look forward to show the presentation we pre-recorded in order to ensure that no connection problems or any trouble would make things more contrary. But also, of course, I want to say that I'm delighted at the opportunity to be involved in the broader international debate about transhumanism, posthumanism, and the questions about the future of humanity and how to think well about this kind of future. I'm not entirely certain about how long I'm supposed to speak here, so the organizers will probably have to tell me that before turning on my actual presentation. But in any case, I would like to say that I have many fond memories of talking about transhumanism in Madrid. I've been previously at the conferences, and I noticed a growing interest in the Spanish-speaking world, which I also think is very promising, because a lot of discussions about transhumanism have happened in English and produced a certain corpus of ideas. But these ideas are, of course, evolving separately from the ideas that happen in other parts of the world. And I think we want to have a global debate about issues that affect all humans, no matter where they are in the world. It's said that one should never start a talk by starting with an apology. But I think I morally need to do that. I, of course, really wish I was physically present at this conference and could participate as fully as the organizers had intended. Alas, the rules for allowing travel in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic at my university recently changed and prevent me from being properly present. And I deeply apologize to everyone who had hoped for more human interactions with me. I will be here as virtually as I can. At the same time, this awkward situation demonstrates what an interesting era we live in. I'm speaking to you remotely, using a computer connected to a literally globe-spanning system of computers and other technology. Each of these have components that are more complex than any individual human could ever build or actually understand. Plagues have been a part of human life from the start, Yet this particular one was detected, analyzed, discussed, and managed. Not always well, unfortunately, but still within weeks and months. And vaccines were produced. The vaccine I, and hopefully most of you, got is a global technological immune system we share. Now, it's also that the university I belong to, Oxford University, can be regarded as a form of a superorganism that has existed and propagated itself for over 800 years, with more people involved at any time than any individual human could personally know. And indeed, this morning I took a pill that I have some rational reasons to think might affect my aging. And I have had a cup of coffee, of course, that I equally expected to sharpen my mind. Now, my Stone Age ancestors, they would probably have been pretty amazed. They might even have asked, this guy, is he human or is he something more? And we would, of course, laugh a bit and say, this is the new normal. So my talk is going to be about this new normal and how the future new normal might be even stranger. So it's a talk about transhumanism, so it's a good idea to try to define the term. Unfortunately, for any interesting concept, there are usually many different definitions. So Julian Huxley, the brother of Aldous Huxley, coined transhumanism as a term in the 1950s. So he was first. He suggested that the human species can transcend itself. It's not just that individuals can improve themselves and become something more, but maybe we humans can turn ourselves into a new humanity. On the other hand, we have a quote from Max More, one of the founders of much of modern transhumanism. And he suggests that transhumanism are philosophies of life that seek the continuation and acceleration of the evolution of intelligent life beyond its currently human form and human limitations, using science and technology and guided by life-promoting principles and values. Now, we might, of course, have a big philosophical debate here about what are these life-promoting principles and values. So he came to this question from a rights and virtue-based ethics perspective. There are, of course, other ethical perspectives one can take. And as will show up again and again in my talk, this is a non-trivial challenge for transhumanism. My own definition from the mid-90s is more about situating transhumanism intellectually as a continuation of the Renaissance and Enlightenment project of making the human condition better, using, among other things, technological means. On the other hand, Nick Bostrom, who happens to be my boss at the Future Humanity Institute, he has a definition that gives another motivation for transhumanism that is different from Max More's motivation. He is arguing that we should explore possible modes of being and try to gain the value that these modes of being can bring. After all, it can be pretty good to be a human. But couldn't there be things that are even better to be? And at least we need to explore that. We need to not just explore the realm of how we can be humans, even in the best possible way. There might be other ways of existing that could be so worthwhile that we should aim at getting there. Now, another thing is, of course, we can try to split it by focus. So quite a lot of transhumanism I encountered in the early 1990s when I first came online as a young student was very individualistic. There was a lot of discussion about how you could try to use modern technology to slow down your aging, think better, and live a better life. So the question was really, how can we, the individual humans, improve our condition? And this might, of course, be done in a lot of different ways. It might involve smart technology. It might involve critical thinking. It might involve gene therapy and trying to upgrade ourselves into something better. Now, one can also start saying, yeah, but humans are social animals. It's not so much that we individually want to enhance ourselves. It's that we actually want to do it as a group. How can we, the current human civilization, improve our condition? And again, even if one doesn't go to the transhumanist side, these questions, of course, exist. We have considerations about sustainability, for example. It's not just that we want to avoid an energy crisis, but we also don't want to hurt the biosphere too much by the Anthropocene. So from an environmental standpoint, we might say that our virtues, we should follow as a civilization to become more sustainable and ensure that our own condition doesn't deteriorate and we don't destroy the biosphere. But the transhumanist version of that is, but we might become something much more. And this is, of course, an interesting challenge because people tend to disagree quite strongly about individual values and even more about what we should do as a group. Even the use of the word we is quite often a problem because it typically makes it sound like everybody agrees. And as we will see, that's of course not true. But there's another way of thinking about transhuman. That is to say, how can we, intelligent life in the universe, improve our condition? This is not based just on us on Earth in the present, but thinking of ourselves as representatives of the biosphere. Maybe this is the only planet in the entire cosmos that has life, an infinitely precious jewel in the endless black. Then we might have a duty to spread life. It might be that there are other intelligent species out there that we must find a way of getting along with. And it might be that we need to work together, or maybe individually as different species, to change the universe. Some thinkers have suggested that intelligence has a very important role to play in the evolution of the universe. But the universe without intelligence would evolve in one direction which might have less value from an ethical standpoint than if intelligence actually starts acting and organizing it. So these are three ways one can approach transhumanism by looking at the focus. Is it about me? Is it about us? Or is it about kind of everyone? There is, of course, always, when dealing with terms and terminology like this, a good chance of getting totally confused. So it's worth mentioning that we need to distinguish between some of the neighbors here in the lexicon. So on one hand, we have humanism, which is the movement that emerged during the Renaissance that said humans matter and we can improve the human condition. But they were, of course, thinking mostly in terms of the books, education, becoming a more refined person, maybe creating institutions. During the Enlightenment, this took the form of other ideas about improving things, which gradually led through the concepts of technology to transhumanism. Now, the transhumanist view is that we can improve ourselves, and that improvement might then lead to us becoming so improved that these future people are no longer really human. They have become their own species. First, they become transhumans and then posthumans in some sense. This invites endless confusion because there is also something called posthumanism in academia. And posthumanism is trying to break free of that human-centeredness of classical humanism. The classical humanist was regarding man as the measure of all things, and hence humans were the center of the universe. While during the Middle Ages, God was the center of the universe. Now it was the human. And the modern posthumanists would say, wait a minute, there are many other things in the world that might matter. And this total centering on humans, or for that, white males, etc., that has a lot of bad effects. We need to be able to break free from this. So critical posthumanism has been spending quite a lot of effort on looking into these things. But it's not the same thing as asking whether posthumans are possible or desirable. A transhumanist talking about posthumanism is most likely talking about various ways you could become posthuman, while a critical posthumanist would probably rather want to critique the assumptions the transhumanist is making. As you can guess, this can lead to endless confusion, but it's also sometimes very stimulating. I do think that as a transhumanist, one should care both about the humanistic roots one is coming from and the critical posthumanist critique, because sometimes they do have a point. Now, are we living in a transhuman world already? Because if you actually just take pictures and headlines from the newspapers every day, you will find that there is a fair bit of the transhumanist technology already happening. So to the upper left, we got Pistorius before his fall from grace, because he's a human after all, but still, like many human celebrities, managed to rise very far on his ability to run very fast despite not having any legs. and then, of course, getting involved in crime drama. But during his peak, he was everywhere in advertising. And that is fascinating because when I was young, of course, there was Nike shoes. And of course, I could imagine them putting various athletes in the ads. But I would never have imagined that they would put somebody who didn't have feet in the ads. Indeed, having a disabled athlete would, back in the 70s, when I grew up, been a kind of contradiction in terms. That's crazy. That has changed. Today, we look up to the Paralympians. Indeed, we look up to the Paralympians so much that it's actually reasonable to put them in ads because they're aspirational. Yes, we might not want to lose our feet, but we can kind of admire that determination that's needed, that if you do not have feet, yet learn how to run very fast. And there is, of course, something elegant, technological, maybe a bit cyborg about those carbon fiber legs. So these days, athletic shoes can be sold by people who don't have any feet. We also have Caitlyn Jenner, and that's a good example of the current discussion about changing genders and gender reassignment, and the real challenge about defining gender in a world where we actually have medical and to some extent social means to redefine it, which of course challenges many important assumptions in society and makes people very, very upset. Because much of traditional society has been based on ideas about keeping categories separate. Man and female, woman, child and adult, left and right, black and white. These categories must not be mixed because that makes the world too complex. Today, the world has already become too complex. And indeed, many people take great delight in blurring the boundaries to the annoyance of others. It's also interesting to notice that some people, of course, would very much like to get more of the complexity. So in the upper middle, we got Neil Harbison, who is colorblind, but thanks to his device that converts color into sound, he can hear sound. So to him, that eye is a piece of music. And he's both presenting a lot of interesting art based on how he experienced his world. And of course, arguing that he's the first legal cyborg, because that little antenna, he regards it as part of himself and managed to get it into his passport photo. There is this big debate about should you allow people to have glasses in photos? Normally, you don't want that because it messes up face recognition. But it's usually said that, well, the glasses are not a part of it. Neil has been arguing that this antenna is surgically mounted in my skull. It is a physical part of me, and removing it would actually be sawing off a part of his body. To the upper right, we have Stellark, an Australian performance artist who used to start his career by hanging himself in hooks from high buildings across streets. But everybody were doing that in the 70s, so he went in a more technological direction and started building additions to his body. A platform with multiple legs that could move like a spider controlled by his body. A third arm, like in the picture, that can move in various ways controlled by his body and do things that are physically impossible for a normal arm. Later on, he had an extra ear to his arm and he had an art exhibition in his own stomach. There is a video showing the art exhibition in the stomach, which is literally the most disgusting art exhibition I ever seen. At the same time, a fascinating challenge as art. Because in this case, he's making his own body an art installation, very much to challenge our assumptions about what bodies are and what they're for. Yes, we're using our bodies. We live, in a sense, in our bodies. We are our bodies, but we can also turn them into art, including art that challenge the very nature of a body and autonomy. To the lower left, that's my friend Todd Huffman, and he implanted a magnet to get magnetic vision. So his little magnet, which is implanted on the skin in the fingertip, allows him to sense magnetic fields. Now, he was expecting to feel the field of Earth, but it turns out it's too weak to notice. But the many electric motors that produce vibrations that he can sense, he noticed that he could detect whether there was current in electrical cables by feeling the field around them. And indeed, he could distinguish after a while mechanical vibrations and magnetic vibrations that you got by using a frying pan on an induction stove. So he has extended his sensory apparatus in a sense, literally with a sense, and to experience something that humans previously couldn't experience. To the right is a portrait of Liz Parrish. She's an entrepreneur in biotechnology, and she has undergone gene therapy to slow her aging. So it's one gene to lengthen the telomeres, hopefully slowing down that aging process, and one gene to produce follistatin in order to reduce muscle loss as she grows older. Indeed, she's pretty good at arm wrestling. To the right of her is the lizard man. And this is what happens to you if you study philosophy too much. A student of Wittgenstein, he was reading this discussion about that we recognize humans through their family resemblance, and asked himself, what happens if I break the family resemblance? So he became a human lizard and a professional freak, and is writing very insightful things from his perspective. And of course, it's an interesting demonstration that sometimes enhancement might not be improvement in performance, but might just be changes. And to the lower right, we have Paul Erdős, one of the most productive mathematicians of the 20th century, renowned as eccentric even by fellow mathematicians, but also a user of cognitively enhancing drugs. Indeed, a friend of him was worried that he was using too much amphetamine and said, you're addicted. You can't stop using them. So he made a bet. And at the end of the month, where he won the bet because he didn't take the drug, he said, yep, I didn't have any good idea this month. You have set mathematics back a month. And that, of course, brings up interesting questions about the practicalities of what we're doing. We might be worried if students were to take cognition-enhancing drugs, partially for health reasons, partially because, well, maybe grading wouldn't be fair if some people take drugs or not. And many people would say, yeah, that's perhaps what the university is for. Of course, others would actually say, yeah, that is exactly what universities are for. It's about socializing and doing stupid things. But the fascinating thing is, when we look at mathematical theorems, we usually do not care at all where they came from. If a mathematician takes a drug that makes his mind sharper or more energetic, so he can produce great mathematical truths, those truths remain true no matter how they came about. So the kind of practice we're engaged in quite often changes what we think ethically about these things. Now, there are many forms of extension and enhancement. And some of them are all about amplifying existing functions, or you have extensions that add entirely new functions. In some cases, the function is simple feedback, like in this very creepy Microsoft advertisement that says that this device can know me better than I know myself and can help me be a better human. I think that is transhumanism in a nutshell, except, of course, that I doubt that the device knows very much. It's basically an exercise tracker. But if you have taken your 10,000 steps, at that point, it will beep happily, and you will probably feel good. I used a tracker like that myself, and I noticed that I started walking more in order to get a little beep from a simple device. It's in some sense absurd. It's like Pavlov's dog. The dog starts associating the sound of a bell with a food reward and soon starts salivating over that food reward. But in this case, it's even worse. I'm kind of salivating over the possibility of getting acknowledgement from a little device on my arm, and that makes me then do something useful. The fascinating thing is, of course, I can get this because I want to exercise more. I have high-level values that I want to be a healthy, active person that try to override my lower-level values that are more lazy and want to preserve energy. So what happens is that this little device helped me stage an internal coup by setting up a feedback loop. And that gets my high-level values to express themselves usefully. Now, the creepy thing is, of course, that this might very well be connected to cloud, and in some cases, health insurance demands to see that you exercise enough, which means that other people are putting the little exercise trackers in little rocking devices that fake that they're exercising. So these feedback loops do not always go as expected. Indeed, many people feel like they're being harassed by their devices. We are very natural at regarding devices and things around us as little spirits, as fellow beings in some sense. And then we incorporate them in our social world. And this is sometimes useful and sometimes can be very, very manipulative. Another interesting aspect of this enhancement world is, of course, self-creation. We already saw the lizard man express himself as a lizard. The grinders, as they call themselves, who made this do-it-yourself surgery to implant diodes under the skin, in that case, it's almost close to self-harm. In many cases, of course, the pain is part of many forms of body modification. If it was that you could get tattoos painlessly and remove them easily, tattoos would lose a lot of their symbolic and emotional value. That change you do to your body that you cannot undo and might require quite a lot of suffering to achieve means much more to you. Now, I would take a fitness pill in 5 seconds flat. I would totally want to have a fit body because that's practically useful. On the other hand, going to the gym, having to show that you have the willpower and the money to go to the gym, that's a signal that you can use to impress people. So many people would say, yeah, that fitness pill is cheating. We should be going to the gym because that allows me to send a valuable signal. The problem is, of course, if that pill is invented, the people in the gym are unfortunately going to have to find some other signal, whether that is extravagant hairstyles or good taste or something else. Now, many of these technologies involve reshaping ourselves, and it leads to interesting questions here about why. What is the value here? What can we do? I have mostly been working on reshaping the human brain. We have been thinking about ways of improving our thinking for a long time. Some methods are very traditional. Get good sleep. Don't drink water with lead in it. Get exercise. They are really effective means. Other methods like education also work to a point. Basic education gives you about 2.7 IQ points per year, but it unfortunately levels off. So we at the university are not as smart as we would like to think. It also turns out that we can do very amazing things by using collective intelligence. It might be hard to improve your brain. You can get fellow brains to think about your problem. And many of the biggest results of mankind are probably due to this kind of activity. Wikipedia, markets, the scientific method, they all are ways of stringing together brains in ways that are error correcting, where the failures of individual editors or individual traders are corrected one way or another by the overall system, allowing us to get a cumulative growth of wealth, knowledge, and scientific insights. But you can individually, of course, train your mind in various ways. There are meditation techniques, and it turns out to exist quite a lot of mental training methods that allows any of us to memorize an entire book. It's not impossible to learn something that allows you to memorize 100-digit numbers. But most of us would, of course, say, yeah, why should I? And that is, of course, the real problem. Spending that willpower and effort on improving yourself, it's only worth it if there's no alternative and if you can afford it. Most of us would rather prefer to take that pill to remember the very long digits. And indeed, since the brain is a biological system, there are ways of fine-tuning or modifying its chemistry. That cup of coffee contains caffeine, which is very similar to a substance in the brain, adenosine, that is used by some neurons to detect that now we have been working for a long time, it's time to take a break and go to sleep. By blocking them, they don't send those signals and we stay alert a bit longer. There are other drugs, of course, that make you way more alert or might actually interfere with the memory processes to make the brain more plastic and more likely to learn things. Typically, this involves trade-offs because it's easy to change one primitive process in the brain while other ones are impaired by that. But if you know what the task is about, then it might be useful. So for writing an essay all night, you might want to take a stimulant. In order to remember and learn what you are studying during the day, you might want to take a memory enhancer. But also, most importantly, sleep really well, because it's during the sleep where memory consolidation moves stuff from short-term memory to long-term memory. So by understanding our brains, we can totally improve our performance quite a bit. But of course, we might want to improve the actual design of the brain. So one possibility might be genetic enhancement. It has been demonstrated, for example, that we can enhance memory in mice fairly well by upgrading various receptors. One particular one, the Doogie mouse, is an interesting ethical example because it has better memory, but it also experiences pains more acutely. And that, of course, leads to this classical question, well, would you want to have better memory if you also suffered a bit more? And my answer is aspirin. You can take painkillers. It's not given that you always need to take the bad side effect. But many of them do involve balancing effects, and that can be quite complicated. We might also start thinking about interfacing the brains to computers. This is an area where people usually don't go very much today. We have brain pacemakers that are useful for some diseases like Parkinson's disease, but generally we can't exchange that much information yet with the brain. But people are working on this electrode system, both outside and inside the skull, that has much more bandwidth. And there are ways of making neurons light sensitive to use optogenetics to actually be able to send light signals to communicate with the brain. This might, in a not too distant future, mean that we can interface our brains to computers much more strongly, and that might allow us to link up with the cloud in various ways. Okay, I've been talking now about many of the things going on. And the question that's in the title is, of course, is transhumanism and posthumanism in some sense fiction? And there is an inherent assumption in that question, and that is, of course, that fiction is non-existent, like dreams and aspirations that have nothing to do with actual reality. Except, of course, that fiction is a very powerful force in expressing and shaping our ideas about what's thinkable, possible, and valuable. And much of transhumanism is aspirational dreaming. Wouldn't it be neat if we can do this? But then it's quite often followed, of course, by the investigation of what the consequences would be, how could we actually do it, and sometimes actual implementation. And this is, of course, the same dynamics as many other forms of technological growth. So here is one interesting example. One proto-transhumanist, Nikolai Fyodorovich Fyodorov, was a Russian thinker and scholar who was active in St. Petersburg during the Tsarist era. And he was trying to figure out how to achieve world peace based on his own rather peculiar religious ideas about what God wanted us to do. And they realized we need a great common task that could unify mankind so we all work together on a vast goal to make the world better. What's the obvious common task? Of course, to defeat aging and death. That's something everybody would want, right? So he started to argue that we need to start small, maybe learn how to control the weather. And then we figure out medicine better so we can stop and cure aging. And then as we get more and more advanced, we will be able to reassemble the atoms of dead people and bring them back alive, because we owe it to them. We are their descendants. We need to help our relatives. But we need to go to space too, of course, because some atoms might have escaped, and Earth, after all, is a finite place. We need more space for all the resurrected dead. You might say that's a peculiar view, but he was good friend with Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, who were discussing his ideas more or less seriously with him. And the interesting thing is, of course, he had an intern at the library, who later went on to become school teacher and author, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. By all accounts, a bit peculiar, and he also had this peculiar idea that maybe we really ought to get to space. So he figured out some of the mechanical issues. That's why we talk about the Tsiolkovsky rocket equation as the foundation for spaceflight. He sketched out issues like spacesuits, space stations, satellites, and really propagated the idea that maybe humanity's destiny lies in space. He came to this, of course, from Fyodorov's grand visions of the grand common task. Then that inspired other people, like Sergei Korolev, who was a military engineer who convinced the Red Army that missiles were useful, and very big missiles might be even more useful, and he created the Soviet space program. And of course, his protege actually went to space. And the story kind of continues. After all, we have modern people who are very inspired by this story. Yuri Milner, a Russian-American entrepreneur, is indeed named after Yuri Gagarin. He set up a breakthrough Starshot project to send space probes to nearby star systems within decades. So this is a good example of how the fiction or philosophical speculations can take a life on its own and propagate very strongly and very far. Of course, by the point the Red Army was thinking about building rockets and go to space, they were not having any of those religious speculations that Fyodorov was bringing up. So the Russian cosmists that kind of followed Fyodorov had to be rather quiet about. And many of the meanings of the concept have changed profoundly. But I think it's a great demonstration of how we can actually go from vision and fiction to people actually building things that actually go into space. And I think transhumanism is going to have similar effects. That, of course, leads to fascinating questions about the ethics of transhumanism. There has been a big debate over the past decades about what the ethics of human enhancement. It is not resolved yet, but I think it's starting to get a bit stale, and for reasons I'm going to get into. But it started, of course, with the debate about eugenics and genetic engineering. So for a long time, people were talking about what's the ethics of actually selecting children for certain traits, or even in some future, if we could modify them to have these traits. In the 1990s, partially inspired by transhumanist experimentation, it started thinking about other forms of enhancement and led to a big, sprawling academic debate about how this fits in, for example, with our medical system. Do the principles of medical ethics speak for or against improving humans? And the answer is, well, you can find arguments on both sides. It quite often depends on what kind of enhancement it is. In many ways, it is a good way of bringing up what the goal of medicine is. Is it just to cure the sick or give us health and a good life? And indeed, when you start looking at many of the ethical issues that do come up in this debate, you will find that they're actually independent of the technology. It doesn't matter that much whether it happens for a pill or reading a Wikipedia article or some weird electromagnetic induction coil you put on your head. People are concerned about the safety and efficacy of these technologies. Can we test them out on children? Is it a good idea? Because, well, maybe we could help kids in school, but there might also be worse side effects in kids, and they can't give consent in the same way. As I mentioned earlier, we have this problem about thinking about cheating. Is it cheating to enhance yourself to get good study results? Or is the good study results actually the goal? Some people would say enhancement means that, we're not going to be authentic anymore. On the other hand, for many purposes, we might say, I actually don't care about that authenticity. I want to be healthy. There are some people who are really worried that it might indeed impact human nature itself. And of course, we have the social aspects. Could it lead to increased competition? Or could it be that some generations get enhancement, but older people don't get that enhancement, and that creates problems. Francis Fukuyama, who was on that earlier slide, called transhumanism the most dangerous idea in the world, because he was afraid that it would destroy liberal democracy, which assumes that we are all the same. If we can become different, doesn't that destroy liberal democracy? Yet many of us would argue that the point of liberal democracy is to allow a society where people are different to function well together. I don't have a time really to get into many of these questions, although some of them are very close to my heart, like the question, do we have an actual moral right to modify our bodies? But it's also worth noticing that while philosophers are thinking about what might be right or wrong, people also have opinions. In one of my favorite papers about human enhancement, they looked into how fundamental different traits like kindness and relaxation and concentration were to people's sense of self. And then asked them, well, if there was a pill that could improve that, would you want to take it? And you might notice that the more fundamental something is, people don't want to modify that. More than 50% wanted to have more wakefulness and language ability, because we don't regard that very much as part of who we truly are. But only 9% wanted to be more kind if it came from a pill. They might be wrong. It might be that if we actually could become more kind that way, we ought to take that pill. But I think it tells us also that in practice, people are very cautious. It's not like many philosophers have suggested that we're all going to run off and buy any enhancement offered by some shady transhumanist in a corner. It's actually quite likely that we are only going to start out rather cautiously. And this is, of course, in particular true for parents who generally tend to want the kids to be safe and well, and a bit better than them, but not too much, because they still want to recognize themselves in kids. There are other interesting questions in transhumanism, though. One of my biggest headaches is that transhumanism doesn't have a single value theory. So many ideologies and movements have an idea why they're doing it. What is the fundamental value one should be aspiring to? The problem for transhumanism is that there are many different ways of motivating transhumanism. You could argue that we should enhance ourselves because that's a virtuous thing. That's a way of becoming a more excellent human being. You could also take an existentialist perspective and say, yeah, there are no rules. It's all up to us. We just do what feels individually right and try to live an authentic life. And if it's authentic for me and according to my values to try to enhance myself, in that case, I should do it. Otherwise, not. There are Christian transhumanists who say, actually, God wants us to be better. And we can even go back and draw on Pico della Mirandola's Oration on the Dignity of Man from 1500s, where Mirandola was arguing that our human nature is to be able to change ourselves. All the other animals have a fixed nature, but our uniqueness is that we can become something more. And that is why there is a dignity to be a human. Now, other critics of transhumanists would say, no, you're wrong. The humans have a fixed nature, and changing that loses that. But anyway, we have many different value theories behind transhumanism, and you can combine it with. And this is a problem, in my opinion, because that means that you can have a Christian transhumanism, a Buddhist transhumanism, and you can have a fascist transhumanism, and a communist transhumanism. You can probably combine it with almost every single ideology. There might even be conservative transhumanists. This might be a good big tent thing if you want to have a big movement. But it also means that besides agreeing on that we should pursue certain things, why we agree might actually not be as simple and might lead to a lot of important disagreements. Another interesting thing is, of course, do we even have a duty to remain human? Again, many critics of transhumanists say, yeah, we should remain human. We shouldn't try to become something different. But many transhumanists would say, no, we should aim for post-human possibilities. Of course, if we do things really badly, it might be a post-human world. We could unleash bioweapons, bad artificial intelligence, or a good old-fashioned nuclear war and go extinct. That is a post-human world. It also seems to have very little value. We might also end up in a low-value world if we actually lose a key trait. There is a very scary paper by Nick Bostrom where he analyzes various evolutionary pathways that lead to a world where there's great economic productivity, but everybody have outsourced their minds to the cloud, and there is nobody at home. There is no consciousness. There is just very efficient economic growth, a Disneyland without children, as he put it. But of course, many people who think about human enhancement might wish to become something like Greek gods, a perfect human life. You can fly. You're beautiful. You can maybe throw some lightning bolts. Or if you're a more science fiction nerd like me, you might start looking into the ability of scanning brains and replicating them in computers to create uploads or whole brain emulations, as I like to call them, or M's, as Robin Hanson, who's written a book about, call it, a form of digital life, which might then perhaps download in robot bodies or copy itself on the internet and go to space along radio. But there might be more radical changes that are possible. If we could change our bodies using biotechnology and nanotechnology to a great degree, we can get new forms of embodied cognition. We might link our brains to each other. This has already been attempted in some extent in lab animals. And of course, we humans quite often try to understand each other deeply to create group minds. To some extent, our universities are a form of diffuse group minds. It's just that we're not densely connected. It might be that in the future we can change human universals, properties that are true for all humans now, and create entirely new ways of seeing the world. It's also not given that you get one post-humanity. It could be that you could get a Cambrian explosion of possible post-humans. Not to mention, of course, that we might create non-human entities, artificial intelligence, animals that have been given extra intelligence, or artificial life of various form. So this leads to this possibility of a post-human world, tremendous variety and weirdness. Sometimes posthumans are described as the next stage of evolution, which badly misunderstands how evolution works, or loosely described as being better in every way, which is kind of self-contradictory because at least posthumans are worse at being non-posthumans or a new species. But that seems to be linked to this idea that biological species membership matters. Nick Bostrom had a rough and ready definition that said a posthuman is a being that has at least one posthuman capacity. And by a posthuman capacity, he meant a general central capacity greatly exceeding the maximum attainable to any current human being without recourse to new technological means. That's a bit wordy, but what he meant is that a general central capacity, something like health span, cognition, emotion, or intelligence. Now, if you improve your health span, so you're immortal, then you might count as posthuman. If you just get an IQ of 170, okay, congratulations, you're a genius, but you're not posthuman. But if you go to 207, that's far beyond any human, then you're posthuman. So these general capacities are the ones that actually matter. Having wings and being able to see in darkness are neat, but they're not central for actually living our lives. Having emotions, having a lifespan, that is quite central. One can quibble about these definitions, but the interesting thing is that there might be a possibility for entirely new general capacities, and there might be entirely new modes of being. And this is why Bostrom suggests that the goal of transhumanism is to explore the space of posthuman possibilities. What is a good life? Maybe a good life is being a blob, experience perfect happiness. Maybe being uploaded and being able to download Wikipedia is great. Maybe we need new forms of fleshiness, or maybe there are things that we actually don't know at all today and are meaningful. That, of course, leads to this question, why should we ever try to become posthuman? Is there any value for humans to try to become posthumans? And I like to use a parable. We can imagine monkeys in the past thinking, should we try to evolve to become post-monkeys? And a smart monkey says, yeah, the smarter you are, the better you are at finding bananas. So post-monkeys would be getting a lot more bananas. And it's true. We humans are great at getting bananas. And we do like sex like the monkeys, but we also like art, philosophy. We have invented things that the monkeys can't perceive as valuable, which we think are really valuable. In fact, so valuable that quite often we forego bananas in favor of studying art. So we might now start thinking about, well, what about posthumans? Oh, they would be better at many important things than us. So we should expect them to be doing great art and understand philosophy perhaps better than we do. But it might very well be that they are going to say, yes, humans, we do indeed like art and sometimes even a banana. However, there are these other things that are actually much more valuable. So much, just like art is so much more valuable than just a banana. There are these things that you cannot even perceive by being human that we really wish you could understand how good it is to have. This is, of course, a hypothesis. It might be that humans are best there could be. That seems a bit unlikely. And this is a reason to explore this space. Rather cautiously, of course, but it's worth exploring. So, going back to us, trying to figure out what we should be doing. I think generally as scholars, we have this challenge that the question of the human condition is very useful. It's not going to go away because the knowledge are getting better and the questions are not disappearing. But we do get challenged to value theory because philosophers have always been thinking about value theory for humans, more recently a bit for animals. But what if we can change what values are? In ethics, of course, there are plenty of important questions. Plus, we get the questions of artificial intelligence ethics, where we might create systems that hold value. There are also, of course, obvious challenges to construct good social and technological policies that deal with these very powerful technologies. And the real challenge to our coordination. I think the deepest challenge here is dealing with the end of humanity. Then humanity might end in a bad way or a good way. I think a good post-humanity would be the good ending. But there is also a real risk that we fail with powerful technology and destroy ourselves or destroy our value. Much of our research at FHI deal with why these existential risks, these threats to human potential are extremely bad. And they could come about from this enhancement project. Conversely, we might be able to get a literally astronomically good future. So one of the interesting ironies here is that when you start thinking about how large the future is, the total amount of value that is at stake, it's literally astronomical. And if we wait, galaxies are literally disappearing over the cosmological horizon if we wait. Yet, if we do a step wrong now, all of that future will be lost. So being optimist about the long-term future, which I think is a trait for transhumanism, is actually leading to the concern about we need to be much more cautious about the present than we might normally think. I do think we have a grand future ahead of us. I think that if we survive and get our act together, then we are set for this amazingly good future, which is going to be much longer and vaster than anything I imagine in this talk. But that's going to require us to think hard about very strange questions. And I'm delighted if I raised some of the questions in this talk. Thank you. Well, thank you for listening, and I would love to hear if you have any questions.
Thank you, Professor Sander.
We are going to start with the Q&A session. I'm going to open the floor for people in the room in case they want to ask anything.
I was remembered that sometime I read something, but I don't remember the author, about awareness or consciousness. And he said that it was not possible for a non-organic element to have awareness or conscience. So I was thinking of the idea of transferring our mind to a device. Our mind in this device would have conscience, or our conscience or awareness will also be transferred to the device or not? Is this possible or not?
That is an important philosophical question, and the honest answer is we don't know. Philosophers have been arguing different positions. I regard myself as a functionalist. I do think that consciousness and mental states come about when you do the right kind of information processing. But there are many of my colleagues who think, no way, that's not true. You actually need to have a particular kind of embodiment. And besides, maybe even if you could upload yourself into a computer, it's not going to be you, it's going to be somebody else. So personally, being a bit of a neuroscientist and empiricist, I would say we need to try to do a brain scan and ask the scanned philosopher, do you feel conscious? And if a philosopher says, oh dear, I do feel conscious, I need to write a paper about it, then we know something. Of course, we might also get the surprising problem that the simulated philosopher says, no, I'm totally unconscious, I need to write a paper about that. So we don't know. I think there are good arguments for why at least some forms of intelligence are substrate independent. But we certainly don't understand consciousness. And this is why I think it's so important to explore the post-human realm. Figuring out what consciousness is might be a great treasure.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There is a question here.
From your perspective as an optimist, what are the gravest dangers posed by transhumanist ideas? I think there are some things people like to bring up that I don't think are the most dangerous ones. For example, some people say, you're perfectionist. You all want to make us all the same in some optimized form. And that's not generally true, because transhumanists are very diverse. As I said, there is no agreement on a value theory, so it points in all directions. I also think that there are various ways it can go wrong and lead to self-harm, etc. But these are not dangerous in themselves. I think the dangerous thing is naive optimism. I think it's important to be optimistic about the future, but you need to be suitably optimistic. I work a lot on threats from emerging technologies, and many of the best technologies for the transhumanist future are also pretty dangerous. Artificial general intelligence, especially if it's super intelligent, can reshape the world, just like we have done. Biotechnology allows us to modify our bodies, but might also allow bioweapons and other very bad things. Nanotechnology, great, total control of matter, perfect recycling, but also some potentially very disturbing implications. If we just rush headlong and try to get all these technologies as quickly as possible, especially because we might want to get our life extension before our hair turns gray, we might end up having too many dangerous technologies. I think we need to work carefully with some of these technologies, even if that means that they don't arrive quite as quickly as we would have wished to. Now, that is tricky because many transhumanists will want to push things forward and also have good arguments that maybe the current world is horribly dangerous. We might want to fix things like the climate and energy scarcity before they harm us. So for that reason, we need to develop technologies fast. My recipe against that is usually to say, yeah, let's make safe-making technologies earlier. Let's build AI safety systems before artificial intelligence become too powerful. Let's figure out how to control biological changes before everybody has a gene lab in the kitchen. So I think we can master these risks. But I do think that this is potentially a dangerous part, but we're so in love with the future that we push forward a little bit too naively.
Thank you. Yes, the question? No.
So if you translate the Spanish questions, I'm happy.
Yeah, good morning. I would like to try to talk in English. Thank you very much for your perspective. I don't know if you see me, I'm Professor Benanti from Pontifical University, Gregorian University in Rome. We meet once in Oxford. Okay, thank you very much. I found a little bit tricky and possible a bias, the linear perspective on evolution. Because we are a complex system, you know, we know there is a state A, monkey, state B, human, state C, posthuman, or what else? Is that a linear progression? Because the evolution shows us that when there is an evolution, it's not so linear. So probably we will gain something and we will lose something else. I'm thinking if it's not a Kahneman, Daniel Kahneman bias, system one cognitive bias, that transforms us in an optimistic view. And I'm thinking if we, as scholars, should introduce a more complex system, a more complex view, that is, I don't want to say naive, neither optimistic, but in some way complex, and say that not all transformation could be positive. And then once again, the question comes back, and what does it mean to be a good human?
Thank you. Yeah, I completely agree. That linear perspective, so often represented by the picture of the monkey and the Stone Age person and the human and the transhuman marching onward, is of course wrong. Biological evolution is this messy branching tree going outwards in all directions. You can't say in biology that one species has evolved above any other. However, the thing is, we humans do something very unique when we think about changing ourselves. We apply a value theory. So by using a value theory, you can actually claim that there is some direction. The thing is, of course, we disagree on the value theory. And I do think it's important to show this complexity, especially because some adaptations only make sense in some contexts, in some environments. And so my dreams about being linked to Wikipedia and having a lot of knowledge works really well in the current world. It wouldn't work so well if I lost the internet. I would become very vulnerable if I became too dependent on an infrastructure. But as long as that infrastructure exists, it's great. And similar, of course, evolution has produced many species that are dependent on other species, which sometimes leads to disaster. I also think that question about what is a good human is something we need to work more on. Excuse me. Obviously, my throat here is in some Aristotelian sense not doing its job because it's interfering with its purpose. Now the interesting part here is, of course, the Aristotelian approach, talking about purposes, is one. We have many other very interesting value theories, and I think actually having a discussion about what do we do when we have a world where different value theories might also lead to cultural and biological evolution in different directions is something that we need to explore. Fukuyama's worry about could democracy work in a world where we're becoming too different, I think it's overblown. But there is an important question. How do you run a society when people are very diverse? Obviously, we need to foster tolerance, but even tolerance itself becomes a complex issue. So returning to the question, can we avoid that linear perspective? And I think that is important. This is why we need to look at the different possibilities. And then we need to start thinking about are there valid reasons to reject certain possibilities or postpone possibilities or say, yeah, you weirdos can try that out. We're going to stay over here far away if that goes wrong and try to learn things from it. I think that might be the best future where we allow exploration, we encourage it, and we help the victims that find that their exploration led them wrong too, so we can jointly develop better. This is where we can do better than biological evolution, because we can learn from mistakes. We can say, we're not going to do that ever again, or that was a brilliant idea, let's try it more.
Hello, thank you very much for the lecture. My name is Father Michael Baggett. I'm a professor in Rome. I actually just finished writing a doctoral dissertation looking at a constructive dialogue between one particular ethic value system, the Thomistic tradition, with a focus on natural moral law and virtue ethics, and the transhumanists, particularly what I call the Oxford School. So you appear in my dissertation, so I would love to share my research with you someday, preferably there in Oxford, once we can travel again.
You're most welcome.
And so I found it a fascinating study, and it was wonderful to hear confirmed my own conclusions, in the sense that these debates about value systems are so fundamental. I did my best to find points of real fundamental agreement between the Thomistic tradition and some of the Oxford transhumanist thinkers. But I also saw that many times there were just these fundamental differences of anthropology, ethical assumptions, and sometimes I found it very difficult to see how we could agree about what is authentic enhancement, right? We say we want enhancement, but if there are these fundamental differences, or if there's such an exaltation in personal autonomy, then sometimes it seems like there's a personal choice to change, but how can society say that really is enhancement, that's really betterment? It seems to be simply a change if it depends too heavily on personal autonomy. So really what I wanted to ask, and I know we have limited time, but what have you found most helpful in advancing this dialogue beyond what seems to be a set of interminable debates about fundamental questions? And if you found maybe a particular school of ethics, a particular tradition, helpful in navigating these very difficult but important questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so my background is computational neuroscience, but I've been sitting in the Oxford Philosophy Department for 16 years now. And one of my best tricks is to say, I don't have an opinion, I only work here. I recognize that I'm not a proper philosopher, and that gives me a bit of freedom to look at different systems. So while I do think that there is indeed a kind of Oxford school of transhumanism, and it's also interesting to observe that it has a quite strong consequentialist bent, and it might even have increased over the past a few years by interacting with effective altruism and long-termism. At the same time, transhumanism I kind of grew up with in the 90s. That was very based on concepts of rights and virtue coming from the extropian thinking of Max Moore. And that tension I find very helpful for being open to different perspectives. While a utilitarian might not think that virtue is really a thing, I can recognize that actually it's quite a great motivator. And while the virtue ethics perspective might say, yeah, it's individual and it's about individual freedom, the consequentialists are quite often very collectivist, saying, no, it's about all of us. So they are working on slightly different levels. The consequentialists, like posthumanists, and especially, of course, the civilization level transhumanists, well, the virtue approach is more on the individual level. And that, I think, is useful. To recognize the splintered value theory inside transhumanism also means that as a transhumanist, you're interested in seeing where else do similar value theories show up. This is where I think Thomas might have interesting things to say, because deontological transhumanism doesn't really exist yet. But I'm totally convinced that one could build fascinating Kantian form of transhumanism. And of course, from the outside perspective, there is usually at least one part of transhumanism that is eerily similar to what one believes, and one can start the dialogue from. But there is much more to be said there, and unfortunately, too little time right now.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question.
Hello, Professor Sandberg. I'm Rafael Monter de Ferrando from Catholic University of Avila. I'm doing my doctoral investigation about the philosophy of history of transhumanism, in particular about singularity, technological singularity. Sorry for my Spanish accent. I'm a Spanish barbarian, or barbarian Spanish, no? Sorry. I have one question. What do you think about the person and the philosophy of FM 2030?
Yeah, I never met him, but he's been interesting and influential to modern transhumanism because he was important because he bridged the world of traditional futures studies that emerged academically as a way of thinking about the future, trying to be rigorous about it, but also developed a kind of activist bent in the 60s and 70s. And transhumanism, by then taking it much further and saying we should also be trying to push for these radical changes. So he's an important link. He was a visionary, but I think he was a bit too early. It's very much the problem for many thinkers that they show up a decade too early. They inspire many people, but we don't quite get that pull that should have. So sadly, I don't think he's directly got involved, but he certainly inspired so much of modern transhumanism. Indeed, you see his influence very strongly on many of the early extropians. Natasha Vita-More, of course, often brings him up. So I think he's a key point of connection. And his philosophy, I think it's interesting because, again, it's early, it's unrefined, and that makes it so much more interesting than the later ones where people have been refining their theories. So I find it very fun to look at his Upwinger manifesto and say, yeah, I also like that as a political manifesto. It fills me with that kind of joy you want to get from a political manifesto. At the same time, it feels very naive. But that's, of course, because it was first. And I think that is an important thing. Many of the naive ideas you see around you, they're the first examples. Later, they get refined and we find out what actually works. But they're important because they set things in motion.
Thanks for all.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think just let's. Okay, one last question, very quick question and very quick answer, please, Professor Sandberg. Okay.
There are several questions from. Hi, thank you. There are several questions from online people, but we have only enough time to have only one. The rest, I suppose, we send it to you by email. This is the first one. What has been the answer of transhumanists to COVID-19 that has evidence that the human beings are vulnerable even nowadays with this kind of technology in our hands? Thank you.
Yeah, I think the big lesson of COVID-19 was both, it could have been so much worse. As a pandemic goes, this was much better than many of the nasty scenarios we think about at our institute. At the same time, it's very clear that this was a pandemic of a type that we knew would happen eventually. And unfortunately, the global society generally didn't respond that well. It did respond well in some places, in some systems, but not others. On the other hand, the science was working perfectly. Within weeks, the virus was analyzed, people developed the vaccine, and then it took normal time to get it out, but we could squeeze down that time. So the technology and science was doing perfect. But it really shows, the real lesson is human coordination is hard. Building institutions that work well together, both nationally and internationally, is hard. We need to make much better work there. And this might not be so much a work for transhumanists as for all people, but we need better governance. Thank you.
Thank you. There are much more questions, but unfortunately we don't have more time left. So thank you very much, Professor Sandberg. Gracias a todos. Creo que ahora nos van a dar bye-bye. Have a nice day. See you next time in Madrid.
Yes, next time in Madrid.